You might have seen more people online talking about something called race realism lately. It pops up in forums, videos, and comment sections, usually from people claiming that they're being scientific about race. This video is about what that actually means, where it came from, and why it's built on bad science. Now, first off, let's be clear. Calling it race realism is like calling astrology evidence-based astronomy. It sounds scientific, but it's a complete scam. Race realists often use the term human biodiversity to make their ideas more palatable. When you dig through their sources, and I use that word generously, you'll start seeing the same pattern. Long science looking posts filled with complex terminology and graphs that they absolutely do not understand. They have probably never read those papers past the abstract. Their tactic is very simple: citations, citations, and lots of citations. They'll dump dozens of papers in your face and then they'll tell you, look, science. But if you actually open any of them, you realize half don't even say what they claim. The rest are usually studies about medical genetics or population structure that never mention race at all. And that's the big thing with these people: misrepresentation. They either don't understand what they're reading or they're counting on you not understanding it. Usually both. They'll say something like, race can't just be a social construct because you can see it, as if visibility equals validity. I can see the sun moving across the sky too, but that doesn't mean it's orbiting us. I can see the earth as flat from where I stand, but that doesn't mean the earth is flat. So science isn't entirely based on what you see. Another thing they love doing: confusing correlation for causation. If two things line up, they assume one must cause the other. If you notice that the ice cream sales go up around the same time as shark attacks, now that doesn't mean ice cream sales are causing the shark attacks. It just means more people hit the beach when it's hot during summers. Correlation is not causation. Race realists constantly make that mistake. Or more likely, they weaponize it. They'll point out some superficial trend like IQ differences or health disparities, and they'll ignore every social, historical, and environmental factor that actually explains it. In this video, I will be addressing the points made here in this image. If you lurk around on Twitter quite often, you might have seen this being shared by people to prove that races are a biological reality. There was a point where I almost got convinced, and then I decided to do some more research in that, and I realized I was wrong. Anyways, let's begin. The first one: race has no biological basis. Here they show a PCA graph that supposedly shows races as separate clusters. Look, Europeans here, Asians here, Africans over here. Therefore, races are real. Their argument is that we find individuals from across the globe clustered together, and that it helps identify populations and races. I tried to go through the paper, and I did find this PCA, but nowhere did I find this exact one with the no continuum written. I think it was perhaps added later by race realists, because nobody who understands how PCA works would write something like that. Now, it is very true that clustering on PCA depends on how close groups are to each other, but it is a little more complex. You'll have to understand how PCA works and how it can be tweaked, manipulated, or misapplied. Imagine you have data from thousands of people around the world. For each person, scientists record information from hundreds of thousands of tiny DNA positions. These are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Each SNP is basically a small genetic switch that can differ between people. Like one person has an A, another has a G. So there are hundreds of thousands of these in every one of us. PCA is a mathematical shortcut to make sense of this mountain of information. So what does PCA do? PCA looks for patterns in DNA by identifying which people are more similar overall. It then creates new axes or principal components that highlight the biggest differences. The first axis, PC1, captures the largest split in the data, like the difference between people of African ancestry and everyone else, while the second axis, PC2, captures the next biggest difference, such as separating East Asians from Europeans. So each person is then plotted on a 2D graph using these axes. So those with similar DNA cluster together, and those who are more different appear farther apart. To make it simpler, PCA is just a map of genetic similarity. It doesn't label anyone as a race, it just simply shows who is genetically closer based on the data you provide. When you plot all those points, you often see small clusters. Europeans might group together, East Asians another way, and Africans in a different area. This happens for simple non-racial reasons. Reason number one: shared ancestry. Populations that have had long histories in the same region tend to share more DNA. Reason number two: geography. The further apart groups are, the fewer genetic connections they have, so they appear more distinct. Mountains, deserts, and oceans used to separate people. Over time, small genetic differences built up. Reason number three: genetic drift. Random changes in small populations make them slightly different over generations. If you do not understand what genetic drift is, I'll explain. Genetic drift is the random change in gene frequencies in a population over time, not because certain traits are better, but purely by chance. So it is not like natural selection where a trait is preferred because it gives an advantage. It's the strongest in smaller populations where luck can make a big difference. For example, imagine a small group of 10 rabbits, 5 brown and 5 white. If a few white rabbits happen to die before breeding, for whatever reason, the next generation might have mostly brown rabbits. Over time, the white gene could disappear entirely, not because the brown gene gives them an advantage, but just by random chance. There is actually a better example. About 200 years ago, a small group of Dutch settlers in South Africa carried a rare gene for Huntington's disease. Because their community was small, the gene became common among their descendants, even though it offers no advantage. Coming back to the topic of PCA, these clusters depend on your input. You add more populations, you get a different kind of PCA. You'll see these clusters blend into each other when you add more samples from different populations living between them. So if you sample from the ends of the human map, say Norway, Nigeria, and China, you'll see three neat clusters. And then you add people from the Middle East, you add people from India, Central Asia, and you'll observe that those clusters will connect into a continuous web. Humanity is a seamless spectrum of genetic variation. Let us make a PCA graph now. We take samples from Sweden, from Japan, from Sudan, and you'll see three clusters. Race realists love this chart. They will say, see, I told you, bro, there are three different races. You can easily plot them on PCA and you can differentiate the three different races. Now, if we add samples from India, from Afghanistan, Iran, Kazakhstan, and Ethiopia, you know what? Let's also add Arab, North African, Berber samples, and maybe Italian and Greek samples too. And now you see the PCA, it's quite different. The clear boundaries vanish. It now looks like a smooth transition from one end of the world to another. The more real-world diversity you include, the less the data looks like separate races. Here's a PCA of all human groups included. You can observe how groups that often mix with each other are closer on PCA. You observe that humans from every part cluster this way. All humans are a mixture of many groups that make us. In fact, you can zoom in on a single country, say France, and you'll find that people from southwestern France and southeastern France form slightly different clusters too. So by the race realists' logic, you could claim that France has multiple races. To summarize, PCA doesn't reveal fixed racial categories, it reveals patterns of shared ancestry and gradual genetic change across geography. The more diverse the samples, the clearer it becomes that humanity forms a continuous spectrum, not separate clusters. What PCA truly shows is our connectedness, not division. Now, some of you may still have the question, why are sub-Saharan Africans still so distant from the non-sub-Saharan African populations in the PCA containing human samples from almost everywhere on Earth? That's because Eurasians migrated out of Africa and did not interact with the sub-Saharan African groups for a long time. And if you remember the points I said earlier, when groups do not mix for a long time, they become more distant on PCA graphs. The samples used here were mostly of non-mixed people, and it was ethnic specific. If we add African American mixed samples in there, you'll see this empty gap fills up too. So PCA clustering does not mean biological races are real. Moving on to the second argument, where they make the claim that Africans, Europeans, and East Asians can be identified with perfect accuracy. And even if it's a continuum, that doesn't mean everyone's equal. After all, red and yellow are still different colors. At first glance, it sounds very logical. Look, even loose groupings like Hispanics match genetic profiles, but that's the trick. It is framed to sound like evidence of discrete biological races, when it's actually a distortion of how population genetics really works. Let us start with what is true. Yes, genetic data can often predict where someone's ancestors came from. If you run a genetic test on someone whose ancestors lived in Northern Europe for thousands of years, you'll see patterns distinct from, say, someone whose ancestors lived in West Africa. But those patterns exist because of geography and isolation. But that doesn't mean they are different races. You can also tell the difference between a Northern Italian and a Southern Italian. It doesn't mean that there are two races in Italy. It's just that the Northern Italians have their own admixtures and the Southern Italians have their own too. Had they used their high IQ to figure out how this works, they wouldn't be sharing this as an evidence for race realism. I'll tell you how we can accurately tell the samples. The basis is social and ethnic classification here. To build these datasets, researchers start with social and ethnic categories. For example, in the East Asian group, they might include people who identify as Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Mongolian. The white group would include people of European ancestry, and the black group would have different sub-Saharan African populations. They collect DNA from individuals who identify with these broad categories and use that as their reference data. And then, when someone new is tested, Their DNA is compared against these reference groups. Naturally, their results will cluster closest to the category they were grouped with. East Asians with East Asians, Europeans with Europeans, and so on. But that doesn't prove biological races exist. It only shows that people who are socially and geographically grouped together have more shared ancestry. In other words, the outcome reflects how the samples were chosen and named. It does not show fixed racial boundaries. Now let us talk about the color argument. It goes like this. If the boundary between yellow and orange and between orange and red is arbitrary, then yellow and red must be the same color. They think this is clever. It isn't. It's a misunderstanding of both color and biology. First, this statement completely misses what the word arbitrary means in this context. Saying the boundaries are arbitrary doesn't mean the entire spectrum disappears. It just means that our divisions within it are human made. In other words, yellow and red are different wavelengths of light, but the names and the exact cutoff points, like orange or red, are things we invented for convenience. Human variation also works the same way. There is no single gene that turns an African into a European or an Asian into a Pacific Islander. Human genetic variation changes gradually across geography. It is what geneticists call a cline, a continuous shift in traits and frequencies. The only reason we see red and yellow as separate is because we chose to emphasize those points. Likewise, the only reason race realists think there are Africans and Europeans as distinct biological races is because they have decided to draw their lines there, not because nature did so. If you zoom in on the color spectrum, there is no line that says, here is where orange officially begins. You could divide it into 3 colors or 100, and both would technically make sense, but neither division would be more real. The same goes for humans. You can group people into 3 races or 100 races. The pattern you see would still be a gradient. The choice of how many categories to make and where to draw the lines is entirely subjective. The yellow and red comparison also fails because it pretends the categories are independent and non-overlapping, that there is an unbridgeable gap between them. But there isn't. In color, every single point between yellow and red exists and blends into both sides. In human genetics, the same thing happens. Populations blend wherever they meet, through migration, marriage, and gene flow. So if anything, the presence of orange, the countless mixed or intermediate populations, disproves the idea of rigid races. It's funny actually, the analogy backfires completely. If you acknowledge that orange exists, you're admitting that the transition is smooth, not abrupt, which means the races, the yellow and red of the analogy, are not distinct categories at all. They are just convenient labels for the ends of a spectrum. Saying, then yellow and red are the same color, is not the clever comeback some think it is. It's exactly the point. Colors blend smoothly, and so do human populations. The boundaries exist only because we decide to draw them. In the real world, all human populations are like the color orange, a blend of others, shaped by centuries of contact, exchange, and adaptation. And the last bit, then yellow and red are the same color. That part tries to twist the idea of social construction into a false dichotomy. It assumes that if categories are not biologically perfect, they cannot describe anything meaningful. But social constructs can describe real phenomena. They just don't define natural divisions. Take nationality, for example. It's not a biological fact, but it shapes identity, opportunity, and belonging. Race functions the same way. It's a social reality, it's not a natural boundary. Colors are real, but color categories, those are made up. Same with people. Human genetic diversity is real, but race is something we invented. In both cases, it's a smooth spectrum that we chop into boxes just to make it easier to talk about, not because nature actually drew those lines. So when someone says, if orange is arbitrary, then yellow and red are the same color, the right answer is, exactly. They're part of the same gradient. That's the point. Nature did not tag light wavelengths or people with labels, we did. And then we convinced ourselves that those labels were real. Moving on to the third argument. Race realists often argue that because the nervous system shows a big deal of genetic variation between populations, human differences must go deeper than the skin color. But this claim completely misrepresents the data. The differences they're referring to are very minuscule. They also like to downplay pigmentation differences by pretending that the pigmentation genes ranked last in the analysis, when in reality they just presented the data selectively to make it seem that way. Yes, there are small variations in traits like pituitary gland development, but these are not exclusive to any group. They appear in all populations and overlap extensively. The authors of this paper never said that human populations are deeply divided or that different races have different brains. What they actually did was measure how much allele frequencies vary between 3 sample groups: Sub-Saharan African, European, and East Asian. They sampled 60 Yoruba people from Nigeria, 60 Europeans from Utah, 45 Han Chinese, and 45 Japanese people. So a total of 210 people were sampled for the study. The point of the study was that different gene groups evolve under different selective pressures. It wasn't saying that races exist, it's about specific genetic markers being different because people adapt. What makes their argument even weaker is how confidently they reference medical and genetic terms they clearly do not understand. When they talk about things like nervous system genes, they imply these are linked to intelligence or behavioral traits, but that's not what those genes represent. Most of these genes are involved in very basic developmental processes, things like forming neural pathways or organizing motor neurons. It does not help in determining cognition or personality. And much of this field is still being researched. We do not fully know the function or evolutionary significance of many of these variations. Race realists usually just exaggerate the minor differences and they misinterpret papers. They also ignore one of the most fundamental principles in genetics, that human variation is non concordant. Human variation is non concordant because most physical and biological traits vary independently of each other, meaning one trait does not predict another. For example, knowing a person's skin color tells you nothing about their height, their blood type, or other genetic traits, as they are inherited separately. This independent pattern of variation is a key reason why the concept of biological races as discrete bundled categories is inaccurate. Now let's move to the fourth argument, Lewontin's fallacy. Race realists often bring up the so-called Lewontin's fallacy, the idea that Lewontin was wrong because Edwards showed that small genetic differences can still distinguish groups. They use this to argue that race has a biological basis. But if you actually look at what Lewontin said, what Edwards meant, and how genetics has progressed since, the entire argument fails. Let us start with what Lewontin actually found. In 1972, geneticist Richard Lewontin analyzed DNA from multiple human populations using classical genetic markers like blood groups, protein polymorphisms, etc. He calculated FST to measure how much genetic variation exists between populations compared to within them. And he found out that about 85% of human genetic variation exists within populations and only about 15% between them. In other words, if you take two random people from the same population, they're almost as genetically different as two people from different continents. This became a key argument against the biological concept of race, that the divisions we call races do not correspond to deep genetic partitions, but rather reflect superficial clustering shaped by geography. Then, in the year 2003, Edwards wrote a short paper titled Human Genetic Diversity, Lewontin's Fallacy. Edwards did not actually dispute the numbers. He agreed that most genetic variation is within populations. When we talk about genetic variation, we need to understand the concepts of locus and allele. A locus is simply a specific location on the genome, like an address for a gene. Each locus can have different alleles, which are just different versions of the gene at that spot. For example, the LCT locus, which controls the production of lactase, has one allele that allows people to digest lactose into adulthood, and another that doesn't. Everyone inherits two alleles from each locus, one from each parent. Scientists often study allele frequencies across populations to see how common each version is. This is the basis for understanding human diversity at the genetic level, and it's also why we can categorize groups based on certain alleles if we want, though such categorizations are arbitrary and do not match social ideas of race. Edwards proposed that while each genetic locus individually shows little between group difference, when you analyze many loci together, you can classify individuals into their populations with reasonable accuracy. That is what population clustering analysis like structure or PCA show. They show detectable patterns of ancestry. In simpler terms, Lewontin said genetic variation is mostly shared. Edwards said that population structure still exists in that shared variation. Both are true, and neither justifies the idea that races are deep biological categories. The key takeaway is that while genetic differences exist between populations, they are small, overlapping, and non concordant. Traits we might use to separate groups, like skin color, lactose tolerance, or disease related alleles, do not predict other traits reliably. So, even if you construct races using specific loci, these groupings do not justify claims about intelligence, behavior, or any other broad human characteristic. Human diversity is real, but it is also complex, clinical, and poorly captured by simplistic categories. Now, the fifth argument. So, here's the claim. Supposedly, the intelligence gap between black and white people is not about history or opportunity, it's just genetics. Nature made one group smarter. This narrative comes from misunderstood science and a desperate need for superiority. They bring up the IQ maps to show how the continent of Africa and some parts of Asia have a low average IQ. Then they connect it with races. The idea that intelligence can be cleanly measured and then assigned to races is built on mountains of bad research and assumptions. IQ tests, for example, are treated like divine revelation by race realists, but in reality, IQ is not a fixed universal measure of intelligence. It is one way of assessing certain cognitive abilities, and even then, it is shaped by education, culture, and the test taker's environment. Think of it like trying to measure athleticism by seeing how well someone swims. Great, but what if the person never had access to a pool? And athleticism can be measured in many different ways, not just through swimming. For most of American history, African Americans were systematically denied access to quality education, housing, healthcare, and basic human rights. Slavery, segregation, redlining, and the war on drugs, all of these shaped generations. It is not a mystery why socioeconomic outcomes differ. It is not because of DNA, it's because of centuries of disadvantage. Let's talk about one of the race realist community's favorite pieces of evidence, the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. This study looked at IQ test results from adopted children of different races raised by white families. On the surface, it seemed to show that white adoptees scored higher on IQ tests than the black adoptees. So, of course, the racists took this and said, see, even when raised in the same environment, there is still a gap. It is genetic. Except, no. For one, the study did not equalize environments the way they claim. Black children with two black parents were adopted later than the white or mixed race children, an average of 32 months old compared to 19 months. That might not sound like a big deal, but in early development, those 13 months are massively important. A child's brain develops faster in the first few years than at any other point in life. Being adopted later, especially after early neglect or poor conditions, has a major effect on cognitive performance. And surprise, the study actually showed that black children adopted earlier scored 7 points higher in IQ on average than those adopted later. Funny how that little detail doesn't make it into race realist infographics. Even beyond adoption timing, the environments were not equalized before adoption. In the 1970s, when this study was published, black children in the US had much higher blood lead levels than white children. Lead exposure in infancy can permanently lower the cognitive functions of a child. So, lead poisoning, poor nutrition, limited access to early education, all of these hit black families disproportionately. But sure, let's pretend those factors don't exist and jump straight to it must be the genes. Some of them also argue that, but even rich black families score lower than poor white families. There is this book called The Bell Curve. It is quite popular among IQ racists, and it tries to prove that race and intelligence are related. The book's author is not a geneticist, he's a political scientist with an agenda. In this graph here, he's trying to prove that the main factor influencing intelligence is not income, but race. So that should mean environment does not really have an impact, right? Well, here's the problem. Income is not the only part of environment. Having money does not change the way society still treats you based on skin color. But this isn't just limited to discrimination. There are a lot of other factors that have caused the black American community to be how it is. Just about 3 generations ago, the US still had segregation and many oppressive laws targeting black people, laws that did not affect white Americans the same way. White Americans also had the advantage of generational wealth. I know I might be generalizing here, but that was the common trend. Black families rarely had that kind of privilege, and when they did manage to build some wealth, they often lost it due to financial illiteracy. Imagine two farmers. One's been growing crops in healthy, nourished soil for centuries. The other's land has been flooded, poisoned, and neglected for decades, only recently drained and restored. Even if you give them the same seeds and tools today, their fields would not yield the same results immediately. People also forget that this kind of scientific racism used to target other European groups too. In the early 1900s, Italian and Irish immigrants were considered genetically inferior. IQ tests given to Southern Italians back then put them a full standard deviation below Northern Europeans. So people were saying that Italians were too dumb and that they would drag down the gene pool. Fast forward a few generations, and now they're considered white. Their genes did not change, their environment did. And this isn't just an American story. After World War II, Japanese and Chinese immigrants in the US were described as low IQ and culturally backward. They were often poor, isolated, and treated as perpetual outsiders. By the 1980s, though, the exact same groups were outperforming the national average on IQ and education tests. When you try to know more about the IQ race correlation, you'll see names like Arthur Jensen, Richard Lynn, and Charles Murray. And if you do not know, let me tell you that these individuals are all connected in various ways to organizations like the Pioneer Fund, which was founded by eugenics advocates with documented ties to white nationalist causes. These researchers have been accused of letting ideology influence their work, and they have been heavily criticized. Richard Lynn, for instance, has been called out for selectively excluding the African IQ data points that did not fit with his narrative because the IQs were too high. This is not objective research, it's more like cherry picking figures to support a biased narrative. Intelligence is shaped by complex, dynamic interactions between genes and environment, and the environment always matters more. The sixth argument. Here they claim that if we classified humans the way we classify animals, we would have several subspecies. Africans are clearly separated from everyone else, and the genetic distance between Africans and Eurasians is bigger than that between animal subspecies. While scientists themselves do not even agree on one precise definition of subspecies. In some animal studies, two populations can be called subspecies if they just look different. In others, it requires deep genetic isolation, and most modern geneticists think the term barely applies to humans at all. The Africans are cleanly separated claim is just wrong. African populations contain most of humanity's total genetic diversity, because that's where humanity evolved. Everyone outside of Africa descends from a small group that left around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Now, race realists love to throw in comparisons like if jaguars have this much genetic variation and are divided into subspecies, then humans must too. Except, fun fact, jaguars do not have subspecies anymore. Scientists used to think that there were 9 subspecies for jaguars, but now it's 0. Why? Because new genetic data showed the variation was not consistent or isolated enough. And this same pattern keeps happening. A lot of so called subspecies in animals vanish once we get better DNA analysis. They'll cite one paper to claim Africans are the most distinct group, but also forget that studies say that African populations are the most diverse within themselves. And since we are talking about selective logic, if you really used the same standards as animal taxonomy, you'd have to admit that there are dozens of human subspecies by now, maybe even hundreds, because every slightly isolated population would count. The Sami in Northern Europe, subspecies. The Andaman Islanders, subspecies. The Basque people, subspecies. The Australian outback folks, also subspecies. It is absurd, and that is why actual scientists dropped this whole idea decades ago. If we took this logic seriously, we would also have to say that domestic dogs, which have massive variation, are dozens of different species, but they're not. A Great Dane and a Chihuahua are both Canis familiaris, and if those two can be the same species, humans certainly can. When we include larger global samples in population genetics, that supposed distance between groups gets smaller and smaller. Humans are not little isolated people. We have been mixing, trading, migrating since forever. The more you look, the more the lines blur. At the end of the day, this myth is not about science, it's about people desperately trying to justify an old hierarchy with new vocabulary. Genetics does not back them up. Biology does not back them up. Even animal taxonomy does not back them up. You can call it subspecies, genetic clusters, or whatever sounds smart, but it all collapses when faced with the actual data. Humans are one species. The FST between wolves and coyotes is also 0.153. Therefore, human races are as biologically distinct as wolves and coyotes, which they say are basically subspecies. It sounds very scientific on the surface, until you actually look at what that FST number means and what the Wolf paper decided was really saying. FST just measures the genetic differentiation between groups. It measures how different their gene frequencies are. It does not say above 0.15 FST equals subspecies. It is simply a measure of how much populations have drifted apart over time. Even though human continental groups have FST values around 0.10 to 0.15, most of our genetic variation, over 85%, is within populations, not between them. And this paper, the race realists love to quote, was not about proving wolves and coyotes to be separate. In fact, it did the opposite. The researchers found low FST values between gray wolves and coyotes. And they said these values are consistent with recent admixture and ongoing gene flow. Wolves and coyotes are not cleanly separate species. They mix a lot. In fact, the study found that red wolves, once thought to be their own species, are basically wolf-coyote hybrids. They're about 25 to 50% gray wolf and 50 to 75% coyote. So when race realists argue that wolves and coyotes have the same FST as humans, they are literally comparing humans to hybrids. The actual conclusion of that paper is that these low FST values show that they are not separate species, which means if you apply that logic to humans, you get the exact opposite result they wanted. We are even less distinct. Another problem, there is no fixed FST number that defines subspecies. It doesn't work like that. Some bird subspecies have FST values as low as 0.05. Some populations with FST above 0.20 are not classified as subspecies at all. It depends on a lot more than one number. Things like ecological differences, consistent physical traits, and reproductive isolation. Humans fail all of those. We have no reproductive barriers, our physical variation changes gradually across geography, and our gene flow has been constant for tens of thousands of years. If FST alone determined subspecies, we would have hundreds of human races. because isolated island or mountain populations sometimes have higher FST values than whole continents. That's how meaningless the number becomes when it's taken out of context. If we followed their FST equals subspecies logic consistently, then wolves and coyotes would not be separate species, and humans definitely would not have subspecies either. Human FST values are even smaller, and our gene flow is constant. The irony is that their FST values and admixture levels were too low to call them a distinct species. So when race realists cite that exact study to claim that humans are subspecies, they're literally using a paper that said these FST values are too small to justify separate species. You couldn't pick a worse example. It is like quoting a paper about why Pluto is not a planet as a proof that it is. Chimpanzee subspecies, our closest relatives, have FST values between 0.3 and 0.5. That is actually 2 to 3 times higher than human groups, and even then we have scientists debating whether some chimp groups should count as subspecies at all. Humans, on the other hand, have extremely low differentiation. We've always interbred freely, and the boundaries between populations are fuzzy and overlapping. That's not what you see in subspecies. That's what you see in a single, highly connected species, and almost every major scientific organization agrees on this. So the wolf-coyote comparison does not validate race science. It just exposes how little its supporters understand the papers they quote. The paper that they were quoting was arguing against them. Myth number 7. The claim here is that scientists have found genes, actual genetic markers, that differ between races and are linked to intelligence or brain development. You'll usually see some fancy terms thrown around: neuronal processes, cognitive ability, neuroplasticity. Basically, scientific words used like seasoning to make their racist slop taste more academic. Let us start with something basic. Human brains are incredibly complex. Intelligence is just not one gene, it's not even 10 genes. It depends on thousands of genes, all interacting with each other and with the environment. So you'd have to also take into account factors like nutrition, education, early childhood stress, toxins, social inequality, and a lot more that can't be boiled down to this race is smarter. You want an example of how ridiculous this logic gets? Researchers once identified a gene called CHRM2 that supposedly correlated with intelligence. For a hot minute, race realists were celebrating like they had discovered the Holy Grail, and later studies couldn't replicate the results. So the supposed IQ gene turned out to have no consistent link to intelligence at all. This has happened again and again. Every time a paper mentions a gene associated with cognition, it gets twisted into scientists found the smart gene in the white race. But when you read the paper, you truly understand what has happened. It usually says something like these results are preliminary or no causal link established, which is science language for calm down, Steve, this doesn't mean what you think it means. Many of the studies these folks cite come from the same handful of bad faith sources, journals like Mankind Quarterly or OpenPsych, which are basically online clubs for race realists to cite each other. Their editors include people like Richard Lynn. I have discussed what he did in the previous section. Now let us talk about what real genetics shows us. When scientists study genetic variation across populations, they find tiny differences, and those differences are usually about physical traits shaped by local adaptation, things like skin color, lactose tolerance, or resistance to malaria. None of that says anything about intelligence or cognitive ability. And even in the few cases where genes might influence neurological development, those differences do not fall along neat racial lines. For instance, a gene variant related to brain growth could be found in 5% of one population and 2% in another. That is not enough to draw sweeping conclusions about billions of people. So, no, there isn't a smart gene for Europeans, a sports gene for Africans, or a math gene for East Asians. And if you still believe otherwise, maybe the only gene difference that matters is the one making people allergic to critical thinking. I know this sounds stupid to say, but there are genuinely people who believe that there is a sports gene for Africans, that there are genetic reasons for East Asians having higher IQs. Now, we can't talk about genetic evidence for intelligence differences without mentioning David Piffer. Piffer basically took something called polygenic scores, which estimate the combined effect of many genetic variants on a trait, and used them to rank populations by supposed genetic potential for IQ. It sounds scientific, right? Except he broke every rule that makes those scores even remotely reliable. Polygenic scores are tricky. They only work accurately within the same populations they were trained on. If you build a model based on European data, and almost all of them are, and then apply it to non-Europeans, the results instantly become meaningless. Why? Because genetic architecture, linkage patterns, and environmental contexts differ. It is like calibrating a thermometer in London and then trying to measure the temperature of the sun. Piffer did exactly that. He took scores built from European datasets and applied them to Africans, East Asians, South Asians, everyone. Then he noticed the scores roughly lined up with average national IQs, which themselves come from questionable sources like Richard Lind's database. And then he declared victory. Studies from the American Journal of Human Genetics and Nature Genetics have explicitly stated that polygenic scores cannot be compared across ancestries. They do not predict the same thing. It's not that the data is bad, it's that the method itself breaks down outside its original context. Even Piffer's supposed correlations vanish when you account for population stratification, meaning differences in ancestry structure and environment that are not related to the trait being studied. Once you fix for that, his genetic IQ gap evaporates faster than his credibility. Race realist argument number 8. The claim goes like this. Supposedly, a study shows that the more European ancestry someone has, the more successful they are. If you have such and such percentage of European DNA, you have higher education, better income, better life. So that small percentage of European DNA determines your entire socio-economic destiny. Let us take this seriously for a second. If a small percentage of European ancestry is all it takes to get a degree, what happens if you have 50% of it? And if 95% of European ancestry equals peak civilization, then why are there broke, uneducated white people in the world? This is straight up a biased scientific fact. First, the study they cite doesn't even measure success, it measures type 2 diabetes risk. Yes, they took a medical study on glucose metabolism and somehow turned it into a racial theory about intelligence and income. Second, even if there was a correlation between admixture and socio-economic status, correlation is not causation. European ancestry does not cause success, but in a country built on racial hierarchy, where lighter skin historically meant access to better schools, jobs, and treatment, of course there is a statistical pattern. It is not genetics, but history showing up in the data. In Latin American countries like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, lighter skinned people or people with more European ancestry have more wealth and education. But it's not because they're genetically smarter, it's because they've been socially favored for 500 years under their colonial systems. If you were born with a system designed to treat you better, you're probably going to do better. That's pretty obvious. This is also why admixture studies are meaningless without context. You can find statistical relationships between ancestry and almost anything: height, income, diabetes, musical taste. You just have to understand the social causes behind it. A lot of factors play a role in making us what we are. It's just easier to pretend that people's DNA can predict and explain everything. It's about their ego, the need to turn a rigged history into a natural law. Because if inequality is in the genes, then no one has to feel bad about it or change anything. And that is what this entire argument is really about. They're trying to argue that the difference is inherent. And that wraps it up. Science is not about proving that you're right, it's about testing what is real. But these race realists, they start with the answer and then dig for whatever looks like the evidence. This is very similar to the Aryan invasion or migration theory. The theory was first constructed, and then we searched for evidence supporting the theory. This is not the right approach. So to summarize the video, people differ, sure, but the division we call races don't explain those differences. History, environment, and opportunity are responsible here. Therefore, race is not biological. It is a social classification, and it is not objective. For some, Semitic groups would be a part of the white race. For the others, only the Germanic branch of Europeans would be considered white. This clearly tells us that race is subjective, and it depends on the person classifying those groups. That was all for this video. Thanks for watching, and seriously, there are better ways to spend your time than arguing with racists about race realism because it is going to kill your time.